There are tales of a wandering elf in the continent of Zoldine. An elf that has felled the largest of foes and has toppled entire battalions. Most call him the Battlemaster, but those who have actually crossed the man himself call him Ezekiel Mira'kel of Ezeria. He's just some brute who knows his way around a sword, the tiefling woman, Allison Scholar, said to her human companion whom just came over to ask for notes regarding arcane matters. She was his senior, however, and Allison wasn't the type of lady that liked being interrupted. Who doesn't know how to use a sword these days? It's such a silly thing to become popular for, she said as she sifted through her notes to give to her associate, Louis Grainer. Her side of the desk in the library always looked like it was hit by some kind of hurricane. Notes and scraps of paper scattered haphazardly across her workstation, but somehow still in the state where she could find anything she required, and at least she keeps her drinks far from her precious notes. He could clearly see that she was getting ready for the competition, reading about historical fights among mages and contemporary uses for abjuration magic, among other material. Allison is an adept-level wizard and an archivist under the organization known as the Platinum Order, an organization that is known for their martial artists and preservation of knowledge through study. Their monks believe in wisdom through martial prowess. Like in battle, the mind must be free from distraction, free from doubt, and free from fear. If the mind is steeled against these three shackles, the monk can find his own understanding of the world. Allison is not a monk, however. She found the martial arts of the monks just another way of barbaric fisticuffs. She doesn't have the patience to chase after some vague concept and practice. The only things that could satisfy her curiosity were the scientific and arcane knowledge that was left for her generation to understand and improve on, and nothing more. The fact such powerful magics are safeguarded behind a thinly veiled ploy to make the intelligent and wise wizards of the region into a mere spectacle for the masses was an insult to her intellect. The only solace she could find in this scenario is finally finding a place to put her skills to good use. Of course, it wouldn't be a competition without some underhanded deals. One she was too prideful to take a part of, but one that she was going to be a victim of. Or so the Goliaths in this dark alley thought. Seriously, whoever thought of sending a bunch of thugs against a practiced mage is a fool, she told them, putting a few fingers on her temples with a smug look just to exemplify how much of a non-issue this situation was to her. "You got a lot of nerve for some scrawny wizard. You think we don't mean business?" one Goliath said, tapping his crude metal instrument on a stray barrel. All it took was a flick of her wrist to put them all to sleep. They dropped to the ground like flies. If the plan of whoever hired these ne'er-do-wells is anything to go by, the competition tomorrow will be nothing short of a trifle. She rushed out of that alleyway as fast as a brisk pace can take her, and bumped into a person on her way out. Chain shirt, a sheathed blade, and a buckler tied to his hip. Ugh, mercenaries, she scoffed to herself, ignoring the blonde elf's apologies and pressing forward to her home with a frown. There were plenty of high-end taverns that could be found in the Saint's Slumberer that would suit a man of his caliber. Some might even say he must go to these places to display the weight of his title and stature. Ezekiel would disagree to such notions, despite the scars he obtained from unimaginable foes and the coin he received from the richest of men. He only saw himself as another person. Yes, a person who was done more than most, but still a mere elf in a vast world. Ezekiel didn't yet see a reason to believe he was more of a man than anyone else. However, he has the impression most people don't quite share his philosophy. They whisper among themselves, some even pointing at the pony-tailed high elf who's just trying to enjoy a drink on the counter with a friend. "By the sound of it, they think you're participating," Ezekiel's dwarven companion whispered to him in a chuckle. "I didn't know you used magic." "Very funny." Ezekiel smiled at her, knowing that magic is a bit out of his depth. He prefers to keep things quite simple. "I'm just here to relax from all the craziness that usually goes on in my life." "Watching a bunch of mages throw magic at each other is your idea of relaxation?" "Well, it's not like I'm going to be there with them," Ezekiel replies. fully expecting to come to the event armed, seeing as how he's actually going to be a bodyguard for a certain wealthy dwarven merchant. It was her way of getting him in there for free, as much as he wouldn't mind just paying to enter. She insisted. Dwarves never forget a debt, even the ones they owe. The night went on a little longer, spending the hours regaling his friend of his recent adventures and showing some old trinkets he picked up on the way here. Those little baubles and his equipment were all that he really owned. The event was taking place around the afternoon, warming up the arena with performers like fire dancers while the wizards get ready. There's some kind of ritual to protect them from any serious harm during the fight. There's even a magic protective dome to protect the audience, if the high walls of the arena weren't protective enough. Ezekiel and Morla were seated together somewhere around the middle section of the circular arena around the north. He was still armed, but his sword and buckler was on his lap. There was no reason for him to really need it on the ready. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Allison Scholar was getting ready for her first match. She was hardly listening to the mage casting the shielding ritual, going on and on about the rules and whatnot. She had read the pamphlet and the sheet of rules that came with it. All that was left to do was to prepare her spells and get this over with. Her first opponent seemed easy enough, some evocation wizard from one of the noble houses. She wouldn't exactly be surprised if this was the one responsible for the thugs that have apparently put some people into the church's healing rooms. She wasn't worried about sounding cold. It's a shame what happened to those folk, but if they couldn't handle a few ruffians, they wouldn't have been able to make it here. Being in the arena was about what she expected, loud and distracting. But she wasn't going to let the noise distract her from her plan. Defeat the mages in her way, win the tournament, and get that precious piece of knowledge. Ezekiel was liking being outside of a fight for once, and just watching the spectacle happen before him, occasionally cheering for whoever catches his attention. The tiefling abjurer was definitely interesting. She was smart to use much of the obstacles and cover to avoid over-reliance on her limited spells, and then retaliating accordingly with the right amount of force. It seemed every mage the audience has seen so far wanted to give quite a show, but Allison Scholar seemed to be the only one concerned with winning. Ezekiel can somewhat relate to that. He can only guess that she was after the prize by the way she fought. The sun had begun its descent, and it was time for Allison's next fight. She had burned through quite a few spells, but with clever tactics, she managed to get by using her more basic spells. Her next foe was a bit on the stranger side. Now, she couldn't care less regarding race or status, but a goblin hermit from the swamps of the Jade Lowlands? What could he possibly bring to the competition? The changing of base formulas of spells, apparently. A fireball to most mages like herself would be of any energy type in the goblin's hands. He wasn't going to be an easy enemy, as much as she'd hate to admit it. At this point, she had tuned out the rest of the world when she entered this arena for the third time now. The crowd was anticipating this fight, both incredibly intelligent and powerful wizards in the field of battle. What will their first move be? Like a game of dragon chess, they gazed into the battlefield as they planned every single move, predicting every cause and effect that could happen. The silence created a tension that left the audience at the edge of their seats, only for them to flinch in shock as powerful conjuration magic began to engulf the many points of the arena. The wizards took cover. From Ezekiel's side, he could see Allison weave a spell. Ezekiel's senses could only flare up, seeing a semblance of a wing appear from one of the bright lights, and in a few moments his suspicions were confirmed. Campions, infernal warriors from the Nine Hells. The fight was immediately called off, but chaos ensued when these horned warriors began to fire beams of flame into the protective shielding, while the guards attempted to hide to either evacuate or to get ready to fight. "Never an easy day for me, huh?" Ezekiel said with his unfaltering but tired smile. "You going to play hero again?" Morla said with a snicker among the increasing chaos around them. "Not a hero, just someone who wants to help." With his shield secured on his hip and his buckler in hand, it was time to lend them some aid. He gave Morla a pat on the head just before he tried to go against the crowd like a fish swimming upstream. He just had to get to the edge. Allison saw another issue as she was trying to scope for a way out. A stone golem was camouflaged within the stone pillar that held the judges. and more importantly, the prized texts on the southeast of the arena. The judges and the prize were stuck up there, as there was a sea of panicked folk to deal with if they were to take the steps down. Another issue was when the shield shattered. That could only mean more casualties. But much to her surprise, it seemed the Cambions were more interested in the mages instead. Specifically her. Allison had to dive away from the incoming spear to avoid getting pierced by it. Each plan she could devise in her head kept falling apart under the stress. And the Cambion that landed behind her as she tried to push herself away from the first didn't help. Even her prideful self was at the verge of screaming for help as her life flashed before her eyes. As she raised her head to meet the creature that was inches away from ending her, blood splatters on the ground. And on her clothes. But it wasn't hers. "Sorry, I'm usually more on time. Keep her head down, please." It was the blonde elf with a steely-eyed look in his emerald eyes, with a focus she had never seen before. Against his wishes, she quickly stood back up to watch the masterful display of swordsmanship, graceful and controlled, like a dance. Allison then shook her head. She almost felt ashamed she was gawking at this man like a child. Who are you?" she stuttered, as she was still in shock from all of this. "Ezekiel Mira'kel, but that's not important right now." Allison watched him shift his stance, his blade and shield now aimed toward the golem. "It's a magical creature, mercenary. Hand me your weapon. It needs to be magical. And Before she could even finish with her plan, the elf rushed in with reckless abandon. Allison would have put a shaky hand to her face to see the brute get himself killed, but to her surprise, each swing of his blade tore through the magic stone like his blade was a chisel. He moved quickly around the golem's wide, brutish swings with elegant steps and deadly counters. Ezekiel always kept a cool head as he fought. The easy thing about golems is that their moves can be telegraphed easily if you're experienced enough. And Ezekiel was definitely experienced. He was wondering why Allison wasn't doing anything, but it didn't matter in a few moments. After a clean evasion going underneath the golem's backswing, it left itself open for quite a strike. The shield boss impacted right on the chest of this 10-foot golem, and it slowly lost its footing, falling over with a sound similar to a boulder being dropped. With a graceful twirl, he found himself at the side of the golem, where he could deliver a coup de grace, ending its artificial life then and there. Allison's indecisiveness led her to doing nothing against that golem. She could hardly predict and calculate her course of action with the elven mercenary's grace distracting her. Even under all this stress, she felt something tug at her chest when their eyes met again, his determined gaze piercing right through her, almost making her gasp. She was taken aback when he suddenly ran toward her, his lips moving as if he spoke, but she could hardly hear a thing but the flapping of wings and a growl. "Wait, what?" She snapped out of her stupor to see a Cambion diving toward her, but this elf had just placed his shield between him and the creature, saving her life the second time. She swore he craned his neck ever so slightly to meet her eyes and give her a secured nod, accompanied by a grinning smile as he took the impact of the spear tip. It wasn't characteristic of Alice to act out of instinct, but something about him made her want to act, raising her hand with a finger dipped in molasses. "Good," Ezekiel thought out loud, as he made his counterattack against the fiend. It was now at a disadvantage from Allison's spell. It moved unnaturally slow, making it easier to strike. But it was very typical of it not to want to go down without a fight. It still proved itself to be quite an opponent. Allison was letting her untested split decision-making take the wheel as she shouted, "Move aside!" to the elven mercenary, creating an orb of electricity and launching it toward the fiend. She felt the ground rumble as another Cambion landed right behind her. She turned to see it as she walked back only for her back to bump into the elf. "What now? We're surrounded!" "Ready a spell. Wait for my cue." Ezekiel raised his voice just enough to pierce through the chaos. A lightning-fast lunge wounded the Cambion once more. "Now, switch!" he shouted. Ezekiel and Allison moved like clockwork as she took Ezekiel's spot and bombarded the bleeding Cambion with magic missiles. Metal clashed against metal as she felt a shove from behind. Allison spun around to see Ezekiel protecting her once again, and then countering with his own set of swings. He steps to the side, and seeing an opening, she launches a witch bolt toward the cambion as the elf overwhelms the demon with rapid strikes she could barely count. As the fiend breaks Ezekiel's guards at one final attempt to kill him, Allison clenches her fist, and the arcane tether between her and the creature bursts with energy, electrocuting the cambion and dropping it before it could bring any harm to her savior. Allison was just about out of breath. In fact, she was ready to pass out from exhaustion right then and there. Her eyes fluttered from the stress and heat. Every limb on her body felt like sandbags that were inches from the ground. But instead of hitting the hard stone floor, she felt a gentle grasp on her shoulder and arm after hearing the clattering of metal. She looked up to see Ezekiel with a look of worry as he tries to keep her balance. She definitely felt her chest tighten as the adrenaline kept rushing across her body, but for a completely different reason as her face turns red. Allison would have demanded for him to let go of her immediately, but as she was in this position, she could see someone up in the pillar teleport away with a sealed box that contained the tournament's prize. The abjurer swallowed this unfamiliar concoction of emotions welling up inside of her and pushed the elf aside. "Someone took the book!" she shouted and pointed to the judges. Looking closer, she could see that some of the guards did attempt to stop whoever that shrouded fellow was. Allison knew the way up there. She just needed to backtrack, and quickly. Unfortunately, she had no energy to follow through. She focused on getting her breathing in check, finding one of the stone structures as support for her back as she does so. "Well, it's good to see you're all right, Allison." Ezekiel sheathed his sword and tied his buckler to his hip. "To answer your question from earlier, I'm just a traveler, but I thought I'd help out when I saw there was trouble." Allison could see that Ezekiel was barely winded, despite the kinds of maneuvers he did against multiple targets. "Don't act so coy, Battlemaster. I know it's you. And how are you not at all tired?" "I'm a little winded, but not by much. Enough experience and training prepares you for this kind of thing." Allison shook her head at the oversimplified answer. There was clearly more to it than that, but she could save further questions for later. "I have to find that prize. I know you will be investigating this mess. I'll be joining you," she told him, steadying her breath finally. Ezekiel usually had to talk his way into having allies or just go at it alone, so this was a nice change of pace. "Oh, well, I'll certainly appreciate the support." He removes one of his gloves and puts his hand out for a handshake, which Allison reluctantly partook in. She had to restrain her eyes from going wide as she felt the smooth, flawless hand wrap around hers. It was like a woman's hand, more woman than hers, even. The cleanup was long and arduous, but they managed to speak to the people currently investigating this mess. Allison was arguing that she should find their own clues instead, but Ezekiel knew that sometimes the simplest solution was the correct solution. The one they could speak to was a halfling man who apparently was hearing whispers about something like this from his informants, but the boldness that was actually displayed was unprecedented. The guards had no issue with someone like the Battlemaster, who had a reputation for dealing with investigations such as this one, to investigate some leads that were previously postponed in favor of increasing security in the event. "Wait a second, you get involved in investigations too?" Allison asked as she kept up with his pace. "That's usually how I figure out who I should be fighting, so yes," he chuckles. Ezekiel always had such an air of carefreeness about him from the way he talks or interacts with people, but it seemed particularly apparent to Allison. She always looked so serious, like a stark contrast to himself. "You should lighten up a bit. I know you're worried, but we're on the case." He gave her a pat on the back. "Maybe you should learn to take things more seriously," she responded, looking unimpressed by his attempts at easing her concerns. "If you were any more laid back, you'd be comatose." Expecting him to be insulted by that snide remark, he just let out a laugh. "By the way I tend to handle things, I'd say that's a fair observation." "Gods, your laugh is wonderful," she whispered to herself, never making someone else laugh before. "Why'd I just say that? He's just a mercenary, nothing more," she thought. Ezekiel didn't quite catch what she said, but his bet was just another jab at him. He didn't mind. Friends tease and mock each other all the time. There was certainly plenty of time for that, as they walked out of the event side by side. "So why do you want this prize so badly? What are we doing here in a tavern? They spoke at the same time, even facing each other from the opposite sides of the booth they were in. Except that Allison was the one who couldn't look at him straight for too long. She disguised it with a sip of a drink, or gazing over random words in her spellbook. I just needed a bit of a rest before we tackled the problem head first. Besides, can't hurt to review our plan of action. Finally, something sensible. She takes a quick gulp of her drink before adjusting her seat to a more comfortable position. The two went back and forth regarding traps and potential squatters in this abandoned house that was suspected to be an old hideout for thieves. There were some pretty out-of-the-box ideas, like threatening to torch the place down to flush out any thieves still in hiding, or creating stink bombs to toss inside. Ezekiel found the suggestions to be quite funny, but Allison didn't think so. We'll keep things nice and simple, Ezekiel tells her. Fine, but it's going to be your fault if any of them get away. She rolled her eyes, already reaching for a new round served to them. I'll be paying, don't worry. Ezekiel fished out some coins in his pocket, but Allison seemed to have already paid for hers. I owe you one too many times for today, Battlemaster. I can pay my own tab. Something seemed to have caught her throat as she cautiously continued her sentence. And thank you for your help. Ezekiel could only tilt his head at the grumbling Allison. What? I didn't quite... I said thanks, she answered hastily. I had it under control, of course, but I still have to thank you for your assistance. Allison silently gritted her teeth at this embarrassing display of appreciation. She either sounded passive-aggressively grating, or a childish fangirl that she would guess he was quite familiar with. This was where his happy, overtly positive facade would break. Who couldn't laugh at such a poor attempt of a simple thank you? You're welcome. I'm just glad you didn't get seriously hurt from that fight. Ezekiel smiled behind the tankard that covered most of his face as he chugged down a good bit of it. It took for a few moments for that to process, that Ezekiel just acknowledged it. Nary a witty remark or insult. She was knocked into a silence with a timid, oh, okay, leaving her lips before a silence developed between them as they relaxed. You never answered my question earlier, by the way, Ezekiel said, passing the time as they walked to their objective. A shiver went down her spine for a few moments. Even her tail stiffened up for a brief second. That's none of your business. I'm a scholar. Why wouldn't I want a priceless, one-of-a-kind book? Fair enough. It's just that you seemed devastated when you saw that guy run off with it. I thought it might just be more than a book. Allison squinted her eyes, looking at Ezekiel, who still had the body language of a tourist. He was clearly more perceptive than he lets on. His facade of a mundane traveling mercenary is impeccable, to say the least. That must be how most of his opponents are defeated. They're too foolish to see what a force of nature he truly was beneath those gorgeous eyes and glistening hair and... Wait a second, what in the nine hells am I thinking about? Allison? Yes? I wasn't saying anything. Allison snapped her head to him, stammering and fumbling over her words. She was quite the eccentric wizard, as far as Ezekiel could tell, but everyone had their quirks. But she seemed more than capable anyway. Yeah, I was just going to say we're here. After a brief, awkward exchange, they began their investigation, starting with a door that Ezekiel simply opens. Allison's heart suddenly dropped as she remembered to check for traps or magic. She quickened her pace to stand behind him, peeking over his shoulder. Oh, no traps? Seems like it. Sounds exciting, but it should make things easy, if there's anything to be found here, anyway. They searched the first floor, which was a barren living room and kitchen area. There was nothing peculiar going on in the kitchen, to Ezekiel's end, so he just decided to come back to the living room, that has its floors all covered in flour now. Telling from Allison's hands, she was the one responsible. Is this for some kind of ritual spell? No, she answered somewhat reluctantly. I just thought someone was hiding in the corners or something, so I tossed some of this flour around to reveal them. Well, at least we know there isn't anyone hiding there. It's a shame we had to waste the flour, though. He just can't seem to just be blunt. She rolled her eyes and made her way to the stairs. I have thick skin, Battlemaster. You can just tell me it was a dumb idea. The elf shook his head at the cynic. I didn't think it was a bad idea. I just didn't think it would work. Ezekiel's fine, by the way. We're friends, after all. We're acquaintances. I don't have friends, she corrected. I just met you today, you know. True, but I try to be as friendly as I can. Can't have too many friends, you know. Let's check this place out. They both arrived at the second floor, not as deserted as downstairs. Sleeping bags were sighted, as well as some scraps of paper on the desk. Allison was a little apprehensive, touching all the dusty things, but she soldiered on and inspected the papers. It was mostly paper with ink ruined by water. It seems like someone just dumped a bucket of water on this desk some time ago. After pushing the useless papers aside, there were some symbols carved into the wood of the desk. Thieves' cant? Hey, did you hear that? Heard what? Allison turned around to see Ezekiel looking back into the stairs. And then she hears it too. A creak from one of the steps, followed by rapid footfalls. By the time the two have converged at the landing of the stairs, a door had closed downstairs. Ezekiel took the lead, rushing down, while Allison followed closely behind him. They would have lost track of this man if it wasn't for the flower on the ground, plainly showing which door he had picked to escape. Over there! Come on! Ezekiel called out, swiftly pulling the door open and running out into what led to a small backyard before it led to multiple alleyways. I told you this would work, she said with a smile, and even a brief laugh as adrenaline began to pump in her system. The Battlemaster wasn't the only perceptive one here. She could still see the flower-covered shoes of the culprit. She swung her hand upwards as she sprinted right behind Ezekiel, sending glistening missiles of arcane power through the air. A few of the missiles struck the cold stone walls, and also might have almost took Ezekiel's head off from their initial launch, but one lucky projectile managed to find its way into the intended target. Ezekiel kept up with the now visible man with ease, but the rogue was quite quick. The elf could only hope Allison was keeping up behind him. Ezekiel was like some kind of acrobat, dodging over every trash can that was knocked over, and later weaving around people with ease, while Allison struggled getting past a coach and a wall of people. The elven Battlemaster finally caught up with him after the man slinked into another alleyway, only to slip from a puddle of water. The hooded man drew his short sword, but it was quickly knocked to the side by Ezekiel's masterful technique. He still quickly got up, attempting to use some pocket sand to blind his assailant. Ezekiel was a little too clever for that, evading just in time and swiftly transitioning into a thrust that only lightly pressed on the man's throat, forcing him to walk back until he was cornered on a wall. Don't move. You don't want this fight, friend. The runner could only nod to who he just realized is the Battlemaster. There you are, you piece of garbage! Allison was out of breath, but shouting at one end of the alley. It looked like she took the long way around. In between breaths, she said to him angrily, You better tell us where your boss is, or so help me, you are not going to leave this alley alive. Enough! Ezekiel swung his blade in the vacant space between the abjurer and the rogue with the most commanding voice he could muster. Allison's hair stood up, and the glow of magic emanating from her hand immediately muted itself as she flinched from the splitting air. That was a tone she didn't expect from the likes of him. The elf sighs, mostly from the chase, but partly due to Allison. He tosses a precious gem to the rugged man as he sheathes his blade. It's yours, friend, if you can answer some questions. Namely, where your boss is hiding, and how do we get there? I have a map in my pocket. His voice was a tad shaky, as he clutches the sapphire in his hand, worth at least a few hundred gold coins, enough to feed himself or a family for a few months. Ezekiel wasn't worried for the hostility at this point. Being the experienced fighter he was, he would be hard-pressed to find someone who could get the drop on him. There was a map full of directions and symbols, but it was cryptic and nearly unintelligible. The runner pushed his way out of the corner, seeing his opportunity. Ezekiel maintaining his balance as he sprints out of here. He's getting away, aren't we? Allison was almost afraid to speak up after hearing Ezekiel that way even once. He slowly turned around, and she knew this is where he finally snaps at her. Should be satisfied to be proven right, but something felt wrong, knowing her actions upset him. I shouldn't be feeling this way, she thought. No, we got what we needed. I'll just trust he'll do something right with that money. Sapphires aren't cheap. What? After all that? Allison was just confused now. She couldn't read Ezekiel at all. She thought he was going to actually show his true colors right then and there. You aren't upset with me? Even I threaten a subdued man with death? What's wrong with you? Nothing, as far as I can tell. Ezekiel replied immediately. His self-confidence was present, but not the friendly attitude. I don't condone what you did, but I'm not one to judge someone else's actions. My guess is that this prized text of yours is more important to you than you care to admit. And you thought that was the right course of action. A reason to get upset. Satisfied? Power, Allison responded, almost cutting him off at the last word. I want the power contained within those texts, and I will pay in my blood or someone else's to get it. She scowled, trying to be unfazed by the indomitable aura that radiated from him. I see. Allison's hands were shaking despite the willpower she attempted to display in her words. Ezekiel felt a little bad that he lost his patience with her, but he had seen too many people lose themselves in pursuit of power. As long as we're working together, no one has to die if they don't have to. Is that clear? Allison crossed her arms with an exhale. I'm not like you, Ezekiel. Her eyes shifted to the map in his grasp. Let's decipher that back in my home. It shouldn't be too far from here. I have my book references there. Her home was actually quite cozy. A bit big as well. Something he didn't expect a single person to have. Allison simply said to stay put in the living room while she fetched some materials from her study. Her mood seemed to have lightened up just a little bit from earlier. Her question still stuck with Ezekiel, as he indulged in some trail mix. What's your purpose? How do you simply arrive in a place and immediately meddle in its inner workings? And why? He couldn't give her a straight answer then. The elf wasn't quite a wise old sage. He was only 36. Quite still young for an elf compared to other races. Ezekiel has been doing this for a long time now. He does all this because of his urge to simply help people, but when confronted with the question of why, that is, he draws a blank. He lived his life quite simply. There were many times in his adventures where he had to make heart-wrenching decisions, but the answer came to him with no deliberation or forethought. He just knew. Ezekiel couldn't help but stretch his legs a little bit while he waited, standing up and just admiring the art decorations across the living room. There was a shelf with a few trinkets placed on top of it. It is right above the portrait frame covered under a blanket, which was quite strange. He was quite good at resisting temptation, but curiosity got the better of him this time. A man and a child, he whispers to himself, thinking out loud. Didn't think you were the snooping type, Ezekiel, Allison said with an unimpressed voice. Ezekiel released his fingers from the cover and flinched. Sorry. I was just curious. I won't ask. If it's covered up, it must be for a good reason. Ezekiel returned to his seat after his brief embarrassment. Allison could only glare at him as she placed a stack of books on the table. She couldn't even afford to scold him in fear of divulging more than she should. She brushed it off for now and proceeded with the deciphering. She and the Battlemaster had quite the afternoon and evening to look forward to.